Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation. Each time I have done so to discuss with you some matter that I believe affected the national interest. In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. In the past few days, however, it has become evident to me that I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress to justify continuing that effort. As long as there was such a base, I felt strongly that it was necessary to see the constitutional process through to its conclusion, that to do otherwise would be unfaithful to the spirit of that deliberately difficult process and a dangerously destabilizing precedent for the future. But with the disappearance of that base, I now believe that the constitutional purpose has been served, and there is no longer a need for the process to be prolonged. I would have preferred to carry through to the finish, whatever the personal agony it would have involved. And my family unanimously urged me to do so. But the interests of the nation must always come before any personal considerations. From the discussions I have had with congressional and other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office. As I recall the high hopes for America with which we began this second term, I feel a great sadness that I will not be here in this office working on your behalf to achieve those hopes in the next 2.5 years. But in turning over direction of the government to Vice President Ford, I know, as I told the nation when I nominated him for that office 10 months ago, that the leadership of America will be in good hands. In passing this office to the Vice President, I also do so with a profound sense of the weight of responsibility that will fall on his shoulders tomorrow, and therefore of the understanding, the patience, the cooperation he will need from all Americans. As he assumes that responsibility, he will deserve the help and the support of all of us. As we look to the future, the first essential is to begin healing the wounds of this nation, to put the bitterness and divisions of the recent past behind us, and to rediscover those shared ideals that lie at the heart of our strength and unity as a great and as a free people. By taking this action, I hope that I will have hastened the start of that process of healing which is so desperately needed in America. I regret deeply any injuries that may have been done in the course of the events that led to this decision. I would say only that if some of my judgments were wrong, and some were wrong, they were made in what I believed at the time to be the best interest of the nation. To those who have stood with me during these past difficult months, to my family, my friends, to many others who joined in supporting my cause because they believed it was right, I will be eternally grateful for your support. And to those who have not felt able to give me your support, let me say, I leave with no bitterness toward those who have opposed me. Because all of us in the final analysis have been concerned with the good of the country, however our judgments might differ. So let us all now join together in affirming that common commitment and in helping our new president succeed for the benefit of all Americans. I shall leave this office with regret at not completing my term, but with gratitude for the privilege of serving as your president for the past 5.5 years. These years have been a momentous time in the history of our nation and the world. They have been a time of achievement in which we can all be proud. Achievements that represent the shared efforts of the administration, the Congress, and the people. But the challenges ahead are equally great, and they too will require the support and the efforts of the Congress and the people working in cooperation with the new administration. We have ended America's longest war, but in the work of securing a lasting peace in the world, the goals ahead are even more far-reaching and more difficult. We must complete a structure of peace so that it will be said of this generation, our generation of Americans, by the people of all nations, not only that we ended one war, but that we prevented future wars. We have unlocked the doors that for a quarter of a century stood between the United States and the People's Republic of China. We must now ensure that the 1/4 of the world's people who live in the People's Republic of China will be and remain not our enemies, but our friends. In the Middle East, 100 million people in the Arab countries, many of whom have considered us their enemy for nearly 20 years, now look on us as their friends. We must continue to build on that friendship so that peace can settle at last over the Middle East, and so that the cradle of civilization will not become its grave. Together with the Soviet Union, we have made the crucial breakthroughs that have begun the process of limiting nuclear arms. But we must set as our goal not just limiting, but reducing and finally destroying these terrible weapons so that they cannot destroy civilization, and so that the threat of nuclear war will no longer hang over the world and the people. We have opened a new relation with the Soviet Union. We must continue to develop and expand that new relationship so that the two strongest nations of the world will live together in cooperation rather than confrontation. around the world, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, there are millions of people who live in terrible poverty, even starvation. We must keep as our goal turning away from production for war and expanding production for peace, so that people everywhere on this earth can at last look forward in their children's time, if not in our own time, to having the necessities for a decent life. Here in America, we are fortunate that most of our people have not only the blessings of liberty, but also the means to live full and good, and by the world's standards, even abundant lives. We must press on, however, toward a goal not only of more and better jobs, but of full opportunity for every American. And of what we are striving so hard right now to achieve, prosperity without inflation. For more than a quarter of a century in public life, I have shared in the turbulent history of this era. I have fought for what I believed in. I have tried, to the best of my ability, to discharge those duties and meet those responsibilities that were entrusted to me. Sometimes I have succeeded, and sometimes I have failed. But always, I have taken heart from what Theodore Roosevelt once said about the man in the arena whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again, because there is not effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deed, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumphs of high achievements, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. I pledge to you tonight that as long as I have a breath of life in my body, I shall continue in that spirit. I shall continue to work for the great causes to which I have been dedicated throughout my years as a congressman, a senator, vice president, and president. The cause of peace, not just for America, but among all nations. Prosperity, justice, and opportunity for all of our people. There is one cause, above all, to which I have been devoted, and to which I shall always be devoted for as long as I live. When I first took the oath of office as president 5.5 years ago, I made this sacred commitment to consecrate my office, my energies, and all the wisdom I can summon to the cause of peace among nations. I've done my very best in all the days since to be true to that pledge. As a result of these efforts, I am confident that the world is a safer place today, not only for the people of America, but for the people of all nations. And that all of our children have a better chance than before of living in peace rather than dying in war. This, more than anything, is what I hoped to achieve when I sought the presidency. This, more than anything, is what I hope will be my legacy to you, to our country, as I leave the presidency. To have served in this office is to have felt a very personal sense of kinship with each and every American. In leaving it, I do so with this prayer. May God's grace be with you in all the days ahead.
Well, one hardly knows what to say. That was a shot of the White House you saw with a squad car or a fire engine on its way to an ordinary, mundane chore in our ordinary and mundane lives while history was being made in the Oval Office. At 9:04 this evening, Richard M. Nixon became the first president ever to resign his office. The talk, as you saw, was restrained and statesmanlike. Mr. Nixon properly accounting his achievements in foreign affairs, listing his desires for this country, pledging that he will go on working for it. The Watergate matter, as the president referred to it, was mentioned only once. The theme of the speech in terms of Watergate seemed to be that the president had lost his political base because of Watergate in the Congress, and therefore found it impossible to continue the policies and the programs of his administration. He did not mention impeachment. He did not mention the fact that the leaders of both the House and the Senate had informed him that he would be impeached and in a Senate trial might be removed from office. He said that his family wanted him to stay unanimously. He said that he wanted to stay on in his term until the end so he could carry on in his work. He said he deeply regretted any injuries that had been caused to people during his presidency. He said that there may be some people, if some of my judgments were wrong, and he said some were wrong, he made those misjudgments in what he thought was the best interest of the country. But what you saw this evening, a moment ago, we are not likely to see again in our lives. We've never seen it before in 198 years of the history of this republic. A president has resigned his office. Tomorrow, we'll have a new president. And the world goes on. I'd like to see what our reporters Tom Brokaw and Tom Pettit have to say about this. They're outside the White House.
Very quickly, John, I should explain that the crowd behind us, demonstrators principally opposed to the president, rushed across to the fence there in front of the White House yelling jail to the chief, so you may hear some extraneous sounds, or at least demonstrators, in the course of our conversation. Clearly, the president expects that his legacy will be his foreign policy. It is the area that he cared the most about, spent the most time on, and it is the area, I think, that he is counting on for his historical redemption eventually. He dwelled at length about détente with Russia, with opening China, and with ending the war in Vietnam. It is the area that President Nixon liked to talk about the most, informally or officially, with Secretary of State Kissinger or with world leaders. He dearly loved to travel, seeking world peace, as he just returned this past summer for political and also for diplomatic reasons from the Middle East and from the Soviet Union. And as a White House correspondent who covers him very closely, I never saw him happier or more confident or more at ease than he was, strangely enough, on the streets of Moscow, or as you saw him, I'm sure, in the streets of Cairo. He probably tonight defined his character with more grace than he did 12 years ago when he said, "I'm not a quitter. I find that abhorrent." This was a very painful, agonizing decision for him, clearly. And for those opponents or critics of the president, or for even those Republicans who have become disenchanted with him, who might have expected some kind of acknowledgement of guilt tonight, he certainly did not offer that. As you indicated, he talked only about losing his political base and what that meant to the national interest for a president of the United States. He said that he'd made some misjudgments, some wrong judgments. He meant not to injure anyone, but he talked not at all about abusing the office of the presidency, and nor did he indicate in any way that he expected to lose the impeachment case or to be convicted in the Senate. He concentrated instead on the loss of the political base and what that meant to all of the people for a president and the great power of that office depending on congressional support. It was 12 years ago in California that Richard Nixon made another farewell speech after losing the race for governor to Pat Brown. My colleague, Tom Pettit of NBC News, was there, and that speech was markedly different than this one tonight, was it not, Tom?
Oh, yes, it was, Tom. I think this was, without a doubt, the best of the Nixon crisis speeches. It was better than Chequers, and it was a lot better than the farewell news conference, I can tell you that. As many of you will recall, that was the speech in which Mr. Nixon was bitterly attacking the press, bitterly attacking anyone in sight, and ended with those famous lines, "You won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore." Well, that wasn't true at that time, but I would suggest that after tonight that now is true. This was a farewell, and it was done very gracefully.
It was, and the interesting question now will be how the country will respond to it, how the political opposition in Congress will respond to it, most importantly, whether there will be pursuit of Richard Nixon as he leaves office. And John, I'm curious about what he meant when he said he shall continue to work, that he will not leave the arena. I wonder what he has in mind for himself. That's something that we don't know. All right, I understand that we're switching to the House Gallery with Ray Scherer and Speaker Carl Albert. Ray?
The president tonight before the speech at the White House.
Yes, at 7:30, the president had the leaders of the Congress, 5 of us, in the Executive Office building, and he gave us a brief summary of what he was going to say tonight. And he fairly well summarized what he did say. He was in good spirits. It was obvious, and he said that he would like to go on with the job. He felt that it was impossible under the circumstances, that the job required the ability of a person to work full-time, that he didn't have that ability when he had to spend so much of his time on other matters. Those who were present were President Pro Tem of the Senate, the Republican and Democratic leaders of the Senate, and the Republican leader of the House and myself.
And there was a personal reminiscence with you?
Yes. As we left, the president, he talked to me 2 or 3 times, but he and I sat right across the coffee table from one another, and with chairs at each end, and 3 senators on the other side on a divan, and another senator on this side. And he said that he remembered when we first came to Congress, and as we walked out, he put his arm around my shoulder and said that we'd been a long time working together. And he was in an unusually good but fairly solemn, but not too solemn state. He smiled frequently, and I really think he came off well. And I think he did in his speech. Maybe it's partly the emotion of the time, because some of my colleagues had predicted to me today that he would lambast the Congress, and he didn't. He told us down there that a president needed to work full-time, so did a Congress, and he hastened to say that if there was an impeachment, it would tie the Senate up from 2 to 4 months. So his whole attitude as he left was one of gratitude for his friends and understanding for those who had not agreed with him.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's a fair question to ask you, if the president left by helping to unite the nation, what you Democrats in Congress intend to do in the way of pledging support to our new president, Mr. Ford?
Well, I think that's one of the most important things that the president said tonight. He told us that this was a killer of a job. Well, President Johnson told me the same thing once. And President Kennedy has said something almost the same. It's a full-time job, and it has enormous traumatic experiences that go with it. And that anyone who had any way of understanding what any person who occupied the job had to go through would want to cooperate with him. And I think that's particularly true of the Congress. We all know Jerry Ford. Everybody but the 5 or 6 new members that we have has served in the House with Jerry Ford. And some of us have served a long time. I was here 2 years before he was. So I've served with him every day that he ever served in the Congress. I like him. And I look upon his job as one of tremendous challenge. I hope I can make it easier for him, and I hope the country can make it easier for him. Because the problems that we have, which President Nixon discussed tonight, at home and abroad, are American problems. They're not just Democratic and Republican problems, and it doesn't do any good to spend time talking about who brought them about if we're ready to work together, and I am. I will work with the idea in mind of going more than halfway, if I can, with the new president. And I think most of my colleagues will. We want him to succeed, because if he succeeds, mankind, and particularly America, succeed. So we have an obligation to try to get Jerry Ford off on the right foot. And this is the last day, I guess, that I'll ever be able to call him Jerry Ford. There seems to be something happens to a person that you don't want to call him by his first name once he actually has the office in his hands.
But, Mr. Speaker, there was no sense of confession or an expression of guilt on the part of President Nixon as he stepped down. What is this going to do to the
You've been listening to Speaker Albert at the Capitol. Now back to John Chancellor.
The honeymoon was announced officially between Gerald Ford, who will be the president tomorrow, and the Democrats who control the Congress. And as Speaker Albert said, they have been friends for many years. And one thing that every observer in Washington agrees on is that the relations, at least at the beginning, and possibly much longer than that, between the Ford administration and the Congress will be quite different in character and nature, and we will all hope in productivity, than they were in terms of the relations the Nixon administration had with the Congress.
Disneyland. It is a carefully reconstructed facade designed to represent the average American small town. Has a strong patriotic motif. There's bunting on the light standards. Earlier this evening, when the band marched forward around the flagpole in a pre-sundown ceremony, they lowered the flag and played the national anthem. There was strong and spontaneous applause. But people here did stop just a few moments ago to huddle around portable radios and to watch a few television sets to listen to the president. And we'll get a view of what some have thought of it. What did you think of the president's speech?
I don't think he's getting what he deserves. I think that he's taking the easy way out by resigning.
And you, sir, let's check with his man. What did you?
He's finally got my vote as to where he's going.
And you?
Yes, I think it's the best thing for our country, really, because he was an ineffective president in the position that he was in.
And your view?
I'm glad that he resigned, but I don't believe he should be prosecuted.
And you, sir?
Yes, it's a sad day for America, for his resignation, but it was needed. It's best for the country. I don't think he should be prosecuted. And I think now America should get behind the new President Ford and move this country along to curb inflation and the problems that America faces today.
Thank you, sir. Ironically, this is where Ron Ziegler, the president's press secretary, once worked as a guide in the Juggaland cruises. Only the most malicious wag here has suggested that Ron Ziegler can have his old job back. Really, most people here take no joy in what's happened to the president or his aides, but that does not preclude their taking joy in fun and fantasy, and that's Disneyland. This is Jess Marlowe, now to Carol Simpson in Chicago.
In Chicago, there is no signs of celebration, but there are also no signs of mourning. All night long, we've been talking about an orderly transition of one administration to another, that this government is secure and that it will not topple, and apparently that's the feeling of the people here in Chicago. Traffic is moving, pedestrians are walking, and things are just normal. Not many people are on the streets, but those people that are and are aware that the president has resigned tonight, most of them say they are relieved. They're glad it's over, and they think he did the best thing for the country. They also expressed confidence in the ability of Gerald Ford to take over the reins of government and get on with the business of the nation. This is Carol Simpson, NBC News in Chicago. Now to Betty Rollin in New York.
There is no cheering here in Times Square. As we've found out from other places, the people here, too, even those who are very glad about what's happened, they are not elated, nor are they gloating, but there are some reactions. What is your feeling about what's happened?
Well, I'm rather despondent right now. I would have liked to see Nixon be impeached. I would like to see him go through court and get criminal proceedings against the man. There's a lot that still remains to be uncovered, a lot that has to be uncovered. Now, by resigning, he's taking the easy way out. The American public won't find out what really went on. And I don't want to be redundant, but there's still a lot to be seen.
Thank you. How are you feeling about this?
I also feel the same way. He's getting off easy because he's not going through court like a normal person who committed a crime, and he's just getting off scot-free by not, getting the whole thing through.
So you don't feel that justice has been done?
No, I don't. By resigning, like the man said, it's taking the easy way out, and I think he should have went through just like a normal person who committed a crime.
Thank you. Sir, what is your feeling about the president's resignation?
Well, I think this has just marked the climax of a really tragic, long, drawn-out performance. I think it's a relief that it's all over. I think he went out in as dignified a fashion as he could, and I think he should be left alone. I think he's suffered enough misery by this whole performance.
You feel sorry for him?
Well, he dug his own grave, but I think if the man's down, why kick him when he's on the ground?
Thank you very much. Sir, you are English, I understand?
Yes, I am.
What is your feeling about this?
I feel sorry for him, but I think he's done the right and honourable thing, and it just shows the strength of a democracy that they can do these things without shooting bullets all over the place.
Thank you very much. This is Betty Rollin, NBC News, New York.
I'm at Fountain Square in downtown Cincinnati, immediately following the president's resignation speech, and with me here is John Hermanys, the chairman of the Hamilton County Executive Republican Committee. John, what was your impact on watching the president give his last and perhaps most agonizing speech?
I was very saddened. I feel a great compassion for the president and his family. I guess my very first reaction.
From the political standpoint, how's that going to affect the Republicans here in the county? Have you been working, as a Republican Party, been working in that regard?
Well, we've been just generally working very hard. We've been organizing, I think, harder and working harder toward this coming election we have in a long time. So we're going to continue to do that.
Republicans have been hurt by Watergate. What effect do you think will the resignation have on voter turnout, voter reaction?
Well, I think the American people have a tendency to unite behind a new president. I feel that Gerald Ford will give them a feeling of unity. I can't help but feel that the Republican Party will be stronger in November than it is now, certainly. And so I think that things should be going up for us from this point on.
Did you ever, at any time, think this would ever happen?
Well, let's say I hoped it wouldn't.
This is Steve Douglas in Cincinnati. Now back to...
The man coming ahead is Paul Miltich, the press secretary, then the vice president, and then 2 Secret Service agents. The applause is by friends and neighbors of Mr. Ford who have gathered here.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Vice President will be making a brief statement. At the conclusion of that statement, he will not be taking any questions. Ladies and gentlemen, the Vice President of the United States.
I think that this is one of the most difficult and very saddest periods, and one of the very saddest incidents that I've ever witnessed. Let me say that I think the President of the United States has made one of the greatest personal sacrifices for the country and one of the finest personal decisions on behalf of all of us as Americans by his decision to resign as President of the United States. It's been my opportunity to watch over a period of nearly 25 years a foreign policy in the last 5 years that has been most successful in the achievement of peace for all of us here and hopefully the rest of the world. It's been a policy that I think can continue peace in the months and years ahead. Let me say without any hesitation or reservation that the policy that has achieved peace and built the blocks for future peace will be continued as far as I'm concerned as President of the United States. We've been fortunate in the last 5 years to have a very great man in Henry Kissinger who has helped to build the blocks of peace under President Nixon. I think those policies should be continued. And those policies of peace will be continued. I have asked Henry Kissinger, as Secretary of State, to stay on and to be the Secretary of State under the new administration. I've known Henry Kissinger for a great many years. I knew him before he came with the Nixon administration. I want him to be my Secretary of State, and I'm glad to announce that he will be the Secretary of State, which means that he and I will be working together in the pursuit of peace in the future as we have achieved it in the past. We have many other problems. We have problems at home which must be resolved. And they can be resolved and will be resolved by the cooperation of the Congress with the President and those that work with him. I've been very fortunate in my lifetime in public office to have a good many adversaries in the political arena in the Congress. But I don't think I have a single enemy in the Congress. And the net result is that I think tomorrow I can start out working with Democrats and with Republicans in the House as well as in the Senate to work on the problems serious ones which we have at home. And the spirit of cooperation which I believe will be exhibited with the Congress and the new president on the problems overseas and the problems at home will be beneficial not only to 211 fine million Americans, but to the world as a whole. And I pledge to you tonight, as I will pledge tomorrow and in the future, my best efforts in cooperation, leadership, and dedication to what's good for America and good for the world. Thank you very much.
Vice President Ford, tomorrow to be President Ford, making a short statement after watching the president announce that he would resign tomorrow. I don't think I've seen Mr. Ford as subdued and somber as he was tonight. He's 61 years old. He never had an ambition to be the president. The height of his ambition was to be Speaker of the House. He gave that up. He promised his wife he was going to retire from politics, and now he is to be the president. He is being kissed and hugged and welcomed and applauded by his neighbors of this Virginia suburb. Mr. Ford announced his first appointment of his administration. It wasn't a surprise, but he announced that Henry Kissinger would be staying as Secretary of State. And he said something that's expected to be the hallmark of the Ford administration, and that is cooperation, conciliation, friendship with Congress, with political opponents, trying to patch up and bind up some of the wounds that have been inflicted on the government in these past few months. As far as we know now, the Vice President will not be coming out of his house anymore tonight. He will go to the White House tomorrow to take his oath of office as President of the United States from Chief Justice Burger. That is about the scene in front of Vice President Ford's house. And now back to you, John.
Thank you, Ron. And so we've seen the man who in about 14 hours will become the 38th President of the United States. The first for whom, incidentally, the people did not vote directly. He was chosen by the President to become Vice President, and now he himself becomes President. Ed Newman is with me now, and we were watching Mr. Ford on television. I must say, we're going to have to get... It's like remembering to write the new year on a checkbook. We're going to have to get used, it seems to me, Ed, to new terms and new terminologies. The Ford administration, when I heard him say, I'm going to have Kissinger as my Secretary of State, there's a little thrill that goes through you when you hear that.
I can't help wondering, John, I suspect you think the same thing. Would he have been willing to accept the job of president if he did not have Henry Kissinger as Secretary of State? He, in that speech, as in earlier comments he'd made off the record and even on the record to some people, he showed the extraordinary degree to which he is going to rely on Kissinger. I think he regards Kissinger as the cornerstone of his administration.
Well, I think there is both practical and political wisdom in that. Kissinger was rated in the polls recently as the public official held in the highest esteem by people in the United States. So I think there's a great political value for him. And practically, I think that Kissinger has, in his dealings with countries overseas, as you know as well as I, made quite a name for himself as a Secretary of State. And the one question that all of us in our business have been asked by foreign diplomats over the past few months is, will Kissinger stay on? They didn't know that the president would, but they were very interested in Kissinger. What do you suppose his administration is going to be like?
Well, I think we saw Ford in a characteristic mood tonight, and he was sincere, he was uncomplicated, and he was halting. Now, it is one thing to be halting in speech, it's another to be halting in action, and I suppose that it is possible to be unhalting in action when you are when you're a little bit halting in speech, as he was and as he tends to be, as characteristically, I think. I should think that it will be as an uncomplicated administration relying on orthodox economic views and following the foreign policy that's already been laid out. I'd be enormously surprised if anything radically new came out of it. Particularly since, as you were pointing out, he is not an elected president. The new vice president will equally be an unelected vice president. It's probably a mistake to think of it as a caretaker administration, but I should think it will be necessarily an unadventurous administration devoting itself to healing the wounds, binding up the wounds.
Well, and in some ways, following on with what you say, he won by one vote. I mean, the president voted for him, Mr. Nixon voted for him, and that's it. And I think that is I'm glad you pointed that out, because I think along with his natural caution, his conservatism in the good sense of the word, I think, you will have that aspect. Now, this certainly doesn't mean that in 1976, Gerald Ford may not run on his own for the presidency and be president until, I guess, 1984 under the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, if he won 2 terms. So the man we saw could be one of the longest-serving presidents in our history.
Yes. We see with Gerald Ford, I think, John, a return to might be called the presidency of the common man. You may remember we got that with Harry Truman, so it was widely stated, and I think we're getting back to something like that. Somebody who claims no degree of eloquence, who claims no special qualifications for the job, and who, as you were pointing out before, did not pursue it. Probably in the earlier days of his political career, probably didn't think he measured up to it. As you say, the peak of his ambition was to be speaker. Well, this is the common man. Whether it's the common man writ large, we're going to find out.
This is NBC Nightly News, Friday, August 9th. Reported by John Chancellor with David Brinkley's Journal.
Good evening. There were 2 presidents in the White House today. Richard Nixon on his way out, and our new president, Gerald Ford, on his way in. Both made emotional speeches. Nixon wept, and Ford choked up when he said he hoped Richard Nixon could find some peace. The transition of power took place smoothly, with moments of great sadness and moments of great dignity. And Gerald Ford became the first man to assume the office of the president without having run in a national election. Here he is, being sworn in.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
the
office of President of the United States
the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God. Congratulations, Mr. President.
In all my public and private acts as your president, I expect to follow my instincts of openness and candor with full confidence that honesty is always the best policy in the end. My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Here, the people rule. In the beginning, I asked you to pray for me. Before closing, I ask again your prayers for Richard Nixon and for his family. May our former president, who brought peace to millions, find it for himself. I now solemnly reaffirm my promise I made to you last December 6th to uphold the Constitution, to do what is right as God gives me to see the right, and to do the very best I can for America.
After making that acceptance speech, Mr. Ford met with the leaders of the Congress, with senior aides of the president he replaced, with diplomats, and began shaping his own White House staff. He pledged to make a thorough search for the right vice president and will announce his choice in a week or so. In all, the biggest day in Gerald Ford's life. And here's Ron Nesson with a report on how it went.
Mr. Ford was up at 6, read the Washington Post's coverage of the drama, and fixed himself breakfast. Then he left for the White House to keep his date with history, with mixed feelings.
I think a feeling of sadness on the one hand and expectation to start to build on the other.
Before taking his oath, Mr. Ford and his wife came to the south lawn of the White House to say goodbye to their friend, Richard Nixon, and the Nixon family. It was an emotional moment of transition and anguish.
Mr. Vice President, are you prepared to take the oath of office as President of the United States?
I am, sir.
If you will raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States.
Mr. Ford has an open and friendly relationship with reporters. An hour after taking his oath, he came to the White House press room and promised to maintain that relationship.
We will have an open, we will have a candid administration. I can't change my nature after 61 years.
The president introduced to the mob of newsmen his new press secretary, Jerry Terhorst, an old friend from Michigan, a respected veteran Washington correspondent for the Detroit News. On his first day in the White House, the new president worked hard to organize and staff his government. He asked the Nixon cabinet and senior advisors to stay during the transition period. They all agreed, including Alexander Haig, the chief of staff. The president named 4 prominent Republicans as talent scouts to recommend members for the Ford team. He held meetings on economic problems and foreign policy. He promised congressional leaders to nominate a new vice president within a week or 10 days. And he made plans to move his family from their suburban Virginia home to the White House early next week. There were 2 vivid symbols of today's transition at the White House. The Oval Office was bare when President Ford walked in. Every Nixon book, picture, and memento was gone. And in the halls around the Oval Office, where huge color photographs of Richard Nixon hung yesterday, huge color photographs of Gerald Ford hung today. Ron Nesson, NBC News, Washington.
It was pretty emotional at the White House today. Tom Brokaw, our White House correspondent, tells the following story. A young girl who works in the press secretary's office was in the press room trying to keep busy so she wouldn't have to think of the day's tragic events. A reporter asked her for a copy of the president's speech, and she started to get it and then stopped, burst into tears, and said, "I don't know which president he means." We'll have the story of Mr. Nixon's day in a moment. At 11:35 this morning, a letter was delivered to the office of the Secretary of State in Washington. This is a replica of it. It read in its entirety, "I hereby resign the office of President of the United States. Sincerely, Richard Nixon." But there was more, much more, to Richard Nixon's last day as the 37th president, and Tom Brokaw has that story.
As president, Richard Nixon has drawn crowds to the vast ellipse south of the White House before, but those were triumphs. This was not. These people were witnesses to the saddest day in the life of Richard Nixon. These were his last hours as President of the United States. Mr. and Mrs. Nixon and their daughters made their final appearance as the first family in the White House East Room, the site of so many state dinners, ceremonies, and dramatic news conferences. The band played Hail to the Chief as the White House staff and cabinet applauded and cried. It was a very difficult time for this man who has so much pride in his public self-control, and his family, which has been through so much with him, struggled with their own emotions. It was time to say goodbye. In less than 2 hours, Richard Nixon would formally submit his resignation, but he would not acknowledge the scandal that brought it about.
No man or no woman ever profited at the public expense or the public till. That tells something about you. Mistakes, yes, but for personal gain, never. You did what you believed in. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong. And we think that when we lose an election, we think that when we suffer a defeat, that all is ended. Not true. It's only a beginning, always. It's only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain. We want you to be proud of what you've done. We want you to continue to serve in government if that is your wish. Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself. I want to say for each and every one of you, not only will we always remember you, not only will we always be grateful to you, but always you will be in our hearts and you will be in our prayers. Thank you very much.
And then the transition took on a human form as the Fords and the Nixons walked out of the White House together. General Alexander Haig, Mr. Nixon's chief of staff, with a final salute of encouragement to his commander-in-chief. Rosemary Woods, Mr. Nixon's personal secretary and close family friend. Then the final helicopter flight as president away from the White House. When he landed in California, Richard Nixon was a private citizen, but he drew thousands of cheering supporters to El Toro Marine Air Base. From there, he went to San Clemente, near where he grew up, and where as a boy he has written, he listened to train whistles in the night and dreamed of far-off places. Tom Brokaw, NBC News, Washington.
Both the House and the Senate today passed unanimous resolutions offering Mr. Ford support, cooperation, and fervent hopes for success, which is not surprising since he spent a quarter of a century in the House of Representatives and is popular in the Congress. But if there was unanimity today on President Ford, there was none where Richard Nixon was concerned. The dispute about a resolution on immunity for Mr. Nixon from future criminal charges is still going on. Catherine Mackin reports.
With former President Nixon unprotected from criminal prosecution, Republicans in Congress are getting more interested in a resolution that would give Mr. Nixon what would amount to congressional immunity and limit his punishment to resignation. Congressman John Rose, the Republican leader in the House, favors immunity and may sponsor the immunity resolution in the House next week. Most of the opposition to congressional immunity comes from the Democrats. Senate Leader Mike Mansfield says the Constitution doesn't allow it, that whatever happens next is up to the Attorney General and the Special Prosecutor.
But there are people who want not only the pound of flesh, but the blood that goes with it. I think we'll let the blood be on their heads, too. The man has been punished, and for God's sake, enough is enough.
After all, he didn't steal any money, he didn't embezzle any money, he didn't kill anybody, he didn't assault anybody, he didn't commit any act of violence. And under those circumstances, it seems to me that his resignation is punishment sufficient.
Republican Senator Marlowe Cook, who's on a committee that would have to draft the law on congressional immunity, said that if Congress doesn't act, President Ford might have to pardon Mr. Nixon. Cook feels the new president should not be involved in Watergate in any way. Others feel it's just too soon to tell which way the wind is blowing on immunity, and the Congress won't have an opinion on it until the members hear how the voters back home feel about it. Catherine Mackin, NBC News, Washington.
If the Congress should pass a resolution supporting immunity from prosecution for Mr. Nixon, it would have no force under the law. Under the law, the most important person in this matter is the special Watergate prosecutor, and Carl Stern reports on the position being taken by the prosecutors.
Attorneys at the Special Prosecutor's Office arrived at work with instructions to postpone any thoughts of subpoenaing Mr. Nixon or of taking any other action against him. The decision was made to wait, apparently until public emotions subside and until there is a demonstrated need, if ever, to proceed against the former president. James Neal, who will prosecute the cover-up case, declined to say whether he wanted to question Mr. Nixon.
Oh, I think, Carl, we've all agreed that we'd have nothing to say about the matter at this time.
Well, would you agree at least theoretically that he's available now for questioning by you?
Carl, I think that really that right now I just better not say anything about it.
Is it outrageous to think that he might be named as a defendant now?
Carl, I think I'd better stay on the no comment.
While the situation was in limbo for the special prosecutors, it was downright confusing for Mr. Nixon's former legal staff.
Did the president take any personal papers or tapes away with him?
I have no knowledge.
Who do you work for now?
I'm working for Mr. St. Clair.
And who does he work for?
He is special counsel to the president.
And which president?
I would assume that to the president of the United States, whoever occupies that position.
This afternoon, the White House indicated future court action over the Nixon tapes and papers would be between the special prosecutor and Richard Nixon, private citizen. The Gerald Ford White House wants to stay out of it if possible. But just in case, Mr. Ford asked top lawyer James St. Clair and his staff to stay on for a while. Carl Stern, NBC News, Washington.
At the courthouse today, those White House lawyers disclosed that one of Mr. Nixon's missing tapes has been found, but that the tape of another subpoenaed conversation was only half recorded because the tape ran out. Another gap in the evidence.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
the
office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God. Congratulations, Mr. President.
Those words spoken by George Washington and each of his successors, Gerald Rudolph Ford today became the 38th President of the United States. And as he repeated the phrases after Chief Justice Berger, Mr. Ford's hand rested on a Bible owned by his son, a theology student, open to a passage of Proverbs. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart.
From CBS News headquarters in Washington, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. And in Washington, Eric Severide, Phil Jones, Dan Rather, Fred Graham, Terry Drinkwater at El Toro Marine Base, California, and David Culhane in New York.
Good evening. Truth is the glue which holds governments and civilizations together. President Ford said as he took office today that, and he pledged an administration of openness and candor. Our long national nightmare is over, Mr. Ford said. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. More on the new President's Day from Phil Jones.
Early this morning, Ford departed his modest home, still carrying his own briefcase, and admitting for the first time that his shoulders were beginning to feel the weight of the presidency. And later in the morning, Ford felt the sorrow of waving goodbye to President Nixon, a friend for the past 25 years. He fought back tears as he stood on the South Lawn watching the departure. He had said earlier, Watergate was the most tragic incident he has ever witnessed. And about 2 hours later, in the East Room, where Mr. Nixon had said goodbye to his staff, Gerald Ford was taking the presidential oath. He declared an end to the nightmare of Watergate.
I am acutely aware that you have not elected me as your president by your ballots. So I ask you to confirm me as your president with your prayers. I have not campaigned either for the presidency or the vice presidency. I have not subscribed to any partisan platform. I am indebted to no man, and only to one woman, my dear wife. As I begin this very difficult job, even though this is late in an election year, there is no way we can go forward except together. And no way anybody can win except by serving the people's urgent needs. To the peoples and the governments of all friendly nations, and I hope that could encompass the whole world, I pledge an uninterrupted and sincere search for peace as we bind up the internal wounds of Watergate, more painful and more poisonous than those of foreign wars. Let us restore the golden rule to our political process, and let brotherly love purge our hearts of suspicion and of hate. In the beginning, I asked you to pray for me. Before closing, I ask again your prayers for Richard Nixon and for his family. May our former president, who brought peace to millions, find it for himself.
The Ford children and guests watched as the new president and first lady departed. And moments later, Mr. Ford, in contrast to his predecessor, was working on warm relations with the White House press corps.
I do look forward to working with you. We will have, I trust, the kind of rapport and friendship as we've had in the past, and I don't ask you to treat me any better than I would expect in reverse.
Later, a briefing by Jerry Terhorst, Ford's new press secretary. No sound cameras were allowed. There were these announcements. The Nixon cabinet and Chief of Staff Alexander Haig have agreed to stay on. Selection of a vice president is uppermost on President Ford's mind, but it will be a week to 10 days before a decision is made. And while confusion reigned at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, back home in Alexandria, with the exception of a few television crews, tranquility was returning. Some Secret Service agents were still around, and some neighbors watched the ceremonies on television. Others hoped the Fords wouldn't forget them.
Man right directly across the street.
He waves to you and shakes your hand and says hello.
Think you'll ever get to visit the White House now that he's president?
Maybe if I'm lucky.
But 514 Crownview Drive will have the Fords back to sleep tonight, and it may be after this weekend before the White House is ready for the new occupants. Phil Jones, CBS News, Washington.
President Ford took office 2 hours after Richard Nixon departed from the White House, leaving behind a letter of resignation to be submitted while he was airborne for San Clemente. The unprecedented letter said simply, "I hereby resign the office of President of the United States." Dan Rather reports.
The president, who has always prided himself on self-discipline while at the center of power, wept at times today as he gave it up. But not as he and his family entered and left the East Room where he wept. They all smiled bravely to thunderous applause from staff and the cabinet. He began his talk with a jab at the press. He praised his late father as a great man and his late mother as a saint. And he talked of mistakes.
Sure, we've done some things wrong in this administration. And the top man always takes the responsibility, and I've never ducked it. But I want to say one thing we can be proud of. 5.5 years. No man or no woman came into this administration and left it with more of this world's goods than when he came in. No man or no woman ever profited at the public expense or the public till. And so I say to you on this occasion, we leave proud of the people who have stood by us and worked for us and served this country. We want you to be proud of what you've done. We want you to continue to serve in government if that is your wish. Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
It was when he talked about his parents that he cried.
Well, I guess all of you would say this about your mother. My mother was a saint. We leave with high hopes, in good spirit, and with deep humility, and with very much gratefulness in our hearts.
He waved his trademark double V arm signal from the helicopter on the South Lawn. Then it was on to Andrews Air Force Base in suburban Maryland. Mr. Nixon refused to say goodbye today, saying au revoir instead, emphasizing to all that he intends to remain active politically and, as he put it, fight for what I believe. Dan Rather, CBS News, Washington.
It was Richard Nixon, private citizen, who came home to California. A good crowd, 3,000 or more, some military, but mostly from Orange County, where Nixon's support has always been strong. It was a welcome by those who were with him to the end and still are. Just like he was still president, one lady said. Nixon responded to the faithful, promising he will continue to be active in public life.
Having completed one task does not mean that we now just sit in this marvelous California sun and do nothing. I can assure you that I am going to continue to work for peace among all nations. I'm going to continue to work for opportunity and understanding among our people here in America. And I am going to continue, and we are all going to continue, to be very proud of the fact that we, like you, are Californians and that we're home again. Thank you.
From here, as he has done so often in happier times, Richard Nixon went by helicopter to San Clemente. His estate, no longer, of course, the Western White House. Now it's to be known by the name he gave it, Casa Pacifica, Peaceful House. Terry Drinkwater, CBS News, El Toro Marine Base, California.
CBS News will have a special report on today's events, including President Ford's full acceptance speech, beginning at 11:30, 10:30 Central Time tonight.
President Ford said, clearly in reference to Watergate, our long national nightmare is over. David Culhane, CBS News, New York.
Expressions of relief that Secretary of State Kissinger will stay on. From China and the Soviet Union, there was no official comment, but Moscow's government paper, Izvestia, expressed confidence détente would continue. In the Middle East, Arab leaders expressed fear and alarm that improving Arab-American relations might wane. Egyptian newspapers bordered their resignation stories in black. Israel felt it had lost a friend. Danish Prime Minister Hartling called the resignation a great day for America, a great day for democracy.
Good evening. President Nixon stunned the country today by admitting that he held back evidence from the House Judiciary Committee, keeping it a secret from his lawyers and not disclosing it in public statements. The news has caused a storm in Washington, and some of Mr. Nixon's most loyal supporters are calling for his resignation. The president issued a statement about the evidence he kept secret, saying, "This was a serious act of omission for which I take full responsibility and which I deeply regret." He also said a vote of impeachment is now virtually a foregone conclusion. Mr. Nixon issued transcripts of 3 recorded conversations he had with H.R. Haldeman on June 23, 1972, 6 days after the burglars were caught in the Watergate. He said this material may further damage his case, but he said that in its totality, all the evidence does not justify impeachment and removal from office. Here's Tom Brokaw with more on the story.
In his statement, President Nixon said that when he listened to the tapes of the June 23, 1972 conversations with H.R. Haldeman this spring, he recognized the potential problems, but he didn't tell his staff, his chief defense lawyer James St. Clair, or the Judiciary Committee. And as a result, according to the president, the case before the Judiciary Committee was decided on incomplete and in some respects erroneous information. The June 23rd conversations contradict earlier statements by the president about why he ordered the CIA to coordinate with the FBI on the original Watergate investigation. More than a year ago, Mr. Nixon explained to the American public that he wanted the 2 agencies to coordinate because he was concerned that national security matters might be compromised. At that time, the president went on to say that he did not want to impede the Watergate investigation in any way. But in his statement today, Mr. Nixon admitted that the June 23rd tapes will show that he was aware of the advantages this course of action would have with respect to limiting possible public exposure of involvement of persons connected with the re-election committee. Those are the president's words. In more direct language, the president appeared to be saying that he was aware that the CIA would provide a cover for his campaign workers involved in Watergate. President Nixon concludes that this disclosure of additional material may further damage his impeachment case, but he urges that the evidence be looked at in its entirety and that the events be looked at in its perspective. In that regard, the president will send on to the Senate all portions of these latest 64 tapes that are released to Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski. Mr. Nixon ended his statement today with this statement: "I am firmly convinced that the record does not justify the extreme step of impeachment and removal of a president, and he trusts that as the constitutional process goes forward, this perspective will prevail." Those are President Nixon's words. Tom Brokaw, NBC News at the White House.
This is NBC Nightly News, Tuesday, August 6th, reported by John Chancellor.
Good evening. President Nixon told his cabinet today that he plans to stick it out, that he is absolutely not considering resignation. But at the same time, the political pressure on the president to resign grew to menacing proportions in the Congress, and especially among members of the president's own party. One of his strongest and most loyal supporters, John Rhodes of Arizona, the leader of the Republicans in the House, said this afternoon that he will vote for impeachment because of the president's disclosure that he had knowledge of the cover-up. Charles Quinn reports.
House Republican leaders made it clear today that they want impeachment over with just as soon as possible, and the Democrats agreed to shorten the process. At the same time, there were new cries from Republican members that President Nixon resign, but Republican leaders said they would not press him on it.
He ought to know by now, and he acknowledged as much in his own statement, that impeachment is a foregone conclusion. But if he insists, if he is adamant on his right to a trial, I do not think that I personally want to be part of any pressure group that goes down and tries to force him from office so that he or anyone else can make the claim that he was hounded from office.
Since I am now convinced that the votes are on the floor of the House to impeach the president, I see no reason, no good purpose to be served in delay or in a protracted debate. I think we should go ahead with it and get it over with as rapidly as possible in the best interests of all the American people.
The president's statement yesterday had something to do with the desire of many members on both sides of the aisle to expedite this, but I want to put that in this framework, that this is one of the most important things we've ever done in this House. And we are not going to have any summary operation.
Some Republicans thought that debate could start as early as next week and be held to 10 hours. But as things stand now, Albert Stead, it will start on August the 19th as scheduled, and it could take a week. Charles Quinn, NBC News, Washington.
The day began in Washington with a steady erosion of support for the president in both houses of Congress among members of both parties. At the White House, a spokesman confirmed reports that the president had considered resignation, possibly as recently as last Sunday, but added that the president obviously did not choose that course. And at 11 o'clock this morning, the president convened a rare meeting of his cabinet and told its members that he is determined to stay in office. Here's that story from Tom Brokaw at the White House.
President Nixon sometimes receives a standing ovation at these cabinet meetings, but not today. During the 90-minute session, the president talked about his intention to stick to the constitutional process of impeachment. White House spokesman said Mr. Nixon does not intend to resign, and no one at the meeting suggested that he resign or step aside.
This is NBC Nightly News, Wednesday, August 7th. Reported by John Chancellor.
Good evening. The question in Washington today shifted from whether or not the president will resign to the question of how and when he may announce his resignation. That was in the minds of many senators, and it was supported by some published reports and by the head of Citizens for Fairness to the Presidency, who predicted resignation unless there is a sudden flood of support for Mr. Nixon. There were no signs of such support. There were signs of continued erosion of the president's position. Mr. Nixon learned this at first hand this afternoon when he invited the Republican leaders of the House and the Senate, John Rhodes and Hugh Scott, along with Senator Barry Goldwater, down to the White House. They gave the president a gloomy assessment, but they didn't suggest that he resign, and he didn't bring up the subject.
From the NBC News Center in New York, this is NBC Nightly News, Thursday, August 8th. Reported by John Chancellor.
Good evening. We now begin our special, continuous, all-evening coverage of the ordeal of President Nixon. He has said nothing in public today, but according to some of his own White House aides, some of the people who are on Vice President Ford's staff, and senior members of Congress, when Mr. Nixon appears on television this evening, he will announce that he intends to resign.